Welcome to Holley History, where we discuss what you want to hear.
No fake news, no alternative facts.
Just history all the time.
Greetings from the Holley Central School District Library. This is Holley History, where we discuss what you want to hear. My name is Nick DeMuro, and I teach 8th grade here along with some assortment of high school electives. I'm joined by
Sheena Hammer, I teach Global here.
Mike Chrisman, I teach U.S. History and Government.
Matt Hennard, I teach Global Studies 2.
Dan Light, I'm teaching 7th grade history and economics in PIG.
All right, with this show, we hope to bring history to our students in district in a different way outside the classroom. We've, in large part, been inspired by Dan Carlin's hardcore history and wanted to model something similar to that, but with our own twist. Each week, we'll have different members of the department sitting down and talking history. With our schedules and the way the school works, sometimes people will leave and come in and come out during the show, so that's just the way it's gonna go. We're aiming to publish one show a month, ranging from 45 minutes to a little over an hour. The goal of our show is to allow members of our district and our students a chance to ask us debate-style questions. You can submit those throughout the month, whether it's in paper copy or email it to holleyhistory65@gmail.com. We're actually going to be setting up a Twitter page too, so you can actually tweet questions at us if you want at some point. But we're going to spend the majority of the show in that questions portion as well. Before that, we'll have the first 10 or so minutes to cover what's going on in our classrooms and dive into a session called Pick Your Brain. In that segment, one of our hosts will ask a debate-style question that we'll all go through. And we thank you for joining us today for our first show, and now it's time for Holley History. So what's going on in the classroom? Sheena, why don't you talk about what's going on in your class right now?
Our class is finishing up an Athens Sparta debate where they're trying to speak about different parts of the Athenian government and lifestyle as opposed to the Spartan society.
I think that was always my favorite project I ever did with Greek and Sparta when I was in school. Did you guys do anything similar to that? When you were in school?
I don't know, I'm pretty old, so I can't remember that far back.
Mike might have been there.
Oh, no. I think I was Dan.
Mike might have been there with Leonidas. Maybe you were the guy that kicked him.
I was part of the 300.
You are rocking the goatee.
Thank you.
So, I mean, that could have been it.
I'll be honest, most of that was done lecture style in the old days.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't a whole lot of
creativity,
debate or creativity in that.
Anytime there's a debate, it seems like the kids get into it, and especially the whole Sparta, warlike, intimidation part. You see a lot of split there between the personalities in class.
Do you think the movie 300's got an impact on kids liking that, or do you find a lot of kids pick the Spartans or the Athenians?
Yeah, that's brought up a lot. A lot of the Spartan guys like to yell, "This is Sparta" in the middle of the debate, just to add to their argument.
The life of a global
up.
teacher.
Yes.
Nice.
Well, 300 also does a horrible job of depicting the Athenians as a bunch of wusses.
I know.
So it's not surprising that.
But they make up for it in that second movie, though, the Rise of the Empire. Mm-hmm. They actually depict the Athenians, and they make a good point of we don't fight because we're forced to. We kind of fight because we want to for our ideals, and so they throw shade right back at Sparta too. Mike, what's going on in your room right now?
We're wrapping up Unit 3, which is basically Washington up through the Age of Reform, 1840s. Mostly recently, we did some research on 6 of the folks from the 1840s: William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Susan B. Anthony. Of course, the rest all jump out of my brain at this point. But kids had to do some research. They did a DBQ-style quiz where they had to take a document and figure out who it most likely was authored by or about, and then answer questions about the document itself. So it really kind of applied some of the new style questions I think we're going to be looking at in the future. So
there's a lot of local connections there too.
Yeah, and it was interesting watching the kids as you talk about Frederick Douglass creating the North Star newspaper, North Star Christian Academy.
Mm-hmm.
And
did you do C.G. Finney?
We didn't do C.G. Finney.
You've done them in the past, though, I thought.
I have in the past. We're trimming back a little bit because we spent so much time on the reformers in the past. But when I look at the test, there's not a whole lot. There's never been anything on Finney. Never anything on the Second Great Awakening, which is a little disappointing.
Yeah, that is disappointing.
So I'm trying to trim and get back to the thing that I talked about in one of my master's classes about just because you know it doesn't necessarily mean the kids need to know it. And that's something I've been struggling with as a teacher. I'm trying to trim back and get back to the basics a little bit. But but to talk about Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and the local connections, it's really cool to watch the kids make that connection and go, oh, that's, and even Harriet Tubman, who's buried in Auburn, which is like an hour away, you know, for the kids to go, oh yeah. Which is funny because I always have to use the outlet mall as a reference point. It's less than 10 minutes from there.
Yeah.
Oh,
They know
oh,
it.
yeah,
Yeah,
I got
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Perfect.
So Matt, what's going on in your room?
Well, we actually just finished up. I don't know if it's probably one of my favorite events of my curriculum, but probably one of the kids' least favorite events initially. But I think they all kind of warm up to it as we go. We just worked on debates ourselves. We're attacking the question, which revolution was more impactful on human history? And they had to decide between the Industrial Revolution and the modern technological revolution. Each student had to research both revolutions ahead of time, some with resources provided by me, some with resources that they found on their own. And they had to make the argument that one was more impactful overall on society than the other. And the big thing that gets them is they didn't get to choose which one. I did drop the bombshell on them today in our follow-up discussion that I feel like it would be very difficult to argue anything but the Industrial Revolution, as I would argue that the Industrial Revolution is the most impactful event in human history.
That's a good pick of your brain question too.
Yeah,
I'm
so
to come back to that.
To argue against that would have been very difficult. It's funny because some of the students were accusing me of setting them up for failure, but we did have some modern technological revolution arguments win, which is a testament to those students and the effort that they put into creating the arguments themselves.
Absolutely.
We carried the debates out in the auditorium with teachers and other students coming in to watch, and they were actually the evaluators of the arguments, not myself. So the winners were actually chosen by the audience, which I enjoy doing. So the students had a great time with it. We kind of debriefed a little bit today and talked about some stuff that came out of the Industrial Revolution, but they were eager, and for as worried as they were about the public speaking factor going in, I feel like a lot of them stepped up and really took it head on, which is good because it's a skill that I keep telling them they're going to need going forward.
Yep.
So it's
And
very exciting.
That came out of that teaching as the core grant group of us attended, and
That's right.
we're challenged to create something authentic style learning. I think what makes that interesting is the kids have to think critically in a way that they don't normally have to think in class, because they have to. It's a persuasive style argument, and I know they hate tying it back to English class, but it's that whole make a thesis and provide the evidence, which is good.
Claim evidence,
right?
The English language,
And they hate that claim. I think they hate that claim evidence language.
Yep.
But that's, I've argued all along, that's what historians do. They
Right.
make the claim and then they back it up with the evidence. And
Yeah.
it makes them think. I think it's interesting as someone who sat in the audience and watched that develop over the last couple of years. It's really come along.
Well,
and the kids have embraced it more.
All good history starts with a question, as one of my professors told me that in college, and that's the question right there. It's Industrial Revolution or modern technological revolution. Every good book you've read in history starts with a really compelling question, and then you want to answer that. Dan, what's going on in your classroom?
Well, we're doing the American Revolution right now. It's funny you guys are talking about that because we've been doing the Paul Revere image of the Boston Massacre. And we've been trying to get the kids, Sandy Smith and I, to understand, hey, what is it that's possibly inaccurate about this image? And the kids love it, actually. They're, initially they're like, oh, it's, you can tell that it's the British are being ordered to fire on the colonists, on that night. And so it's kind of interesting. But yeah, we've been doing taxes. We've really been talking, with the 7th graders at least, we've been talking a lot about boycotts and repealing a tax and that kind of thing, looking at the links between England and the colonies. So that's kind of where we've been focused. But they really love it. They love it when, the Sons of Liberty are dumping the tea. They love it when they realize that, hey, those British soldiers were actually being egged on by the colonists, and it certainly is not, like that image that we always see with the guy giving the signal, like we're all going to fire on the colonists, these 20-some colonists here,
Yep.
So it's really interesting how you say that, how you get those kids to really when they realize, hey, it's not exactly the way I thought it was. It's kind of like a moment that they have. They're like, oh, geez, it's not quite like the picture makes it look, is it?
Yeah.
So that's what I love about history, and that's what they like too, I think.
That's an
That's
interesting
profound.
thing to me too, just thinking about the idea of historiography and how the
Yes,
history,
yeah.
you know, the kids have a hard time when I talk to them about the history of history and how history actually changes over time because as new technology
And
comes
that's so
out,
foreign to them.
Right. We
It's like,
discover
what?
new things, we learn new things, we say, you start thinking a different way, you
Yeah.
know, right after something you have one viewpoint, but then maybe 100 years later you can say, well, is that really how it went? Or was that how it was spun? And then you start digging deeper.
And why it was spun, too.
Right. And it blows their mind to see them really experience the idea of, wow, maybe what I feel like in elementary school they always take history for gospel. And one of the things that I really, really love about our department is I feel like everybody in the department challenges the kids to challenge history, right? Well, why might that not be true? And that like makes their head spin because they're just like, wait a minute, what do you mean history that we know might not be true?
Yeah.
That whole idea of point of view is so important with the Boston Massacre. I love that exercise, and I've tried similar things when I'm teaching American history too, because you're right. They do want to look at a textbook. Well, if it's in the textbook, that's the way it had to have happened.
Right, that's
Yeah.
gospel.
And love being able to pick out things from past textbooks or textbooks from other countries and how they look at something and view something and challenge them to really rethink what they're doing.
Yeah, and we learned that, we went over that word spin. That whole idea of spin. A lot of the seventh graders, what do you mean put a spin on something? I said, well, Paul Revere really puts a spin on this. Think about it. They're all lined up. All the guns are facing. There's a guy with his hand up as if he's going to put it down. And you can tell from the story, if someone's throwing rocks and oysters and things at you, you really are feeling panicked. You do not feel, this is... And they were kind of like, oh, that's what you mean by putting his spin on this. So all the other colonies see it and think, hey, this is the way it must have been when, it's funny when the realization.
Well, in 8th grade right now, where we're just wrapping up the immigration project where they go through the Ellis Island databases, trying to find a family relative. The biggest challenge of this project is we have an account pre-made because not every student has an email. And if you enter the account information in wrong 3 consecutive times, it locks the account out. So you got kids missing like periods and then the @ symbol and .com. So you're talking like the biggest challenges right there with just that. I think I got through like the first day and the first 2 periods didn't lock it out. It was like Christmas miracle, like never happened before. And then like they locked it like 4 times in 1 period, 5th period. So it was tough, but it's a really good project because they get in touch with the past. And that will segue well into our next conversation is you learn so much. I mean, those records have eye color, marks of identification, how much money they had on them. Did they have a ticket to the destination, where they were going, who they were going to stay with, what their profession was. And then when the kids get to the portion, like, what's a polygamist, Mr. D? So we have to talk about what a polygamist is. And then anarchists, they ask them if they're anarchists because the anarchist movement was huge in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that's also like a super interesting part. And they have to take the information and use it to write the narrative about that immigrant and what their experience was like. And then today we got to labor, so we kind of segued well from immigration to the labor movement there. And then the World Wars class, I was just going to, I co-teach with Mike and Matt. I was going to kind of speak for them here just because I had it written down. We just did a massive project that Mike created on why the U.S. entered World War I, in which they had like 7 or 8 different points of view. They had to adopt one, kind of make their case with it. And they began their presentations today. So that's kind of what's going on in each of our classrooms. Our next segment now is the Pick Your Brain segment for about 12, 15 minutes. And each week, one of us will bring a question to discuss, and we're going to talk about it. And the first question we want to ask is, why is social studies the most important content area? If it is, if we do think that. And I'm inclined to think everybody here does.
Absolutely.
I want to hear from Sheena first, though. Sheena, why is social studies the most important content area right now? Why is it the most important?
I think that social studies gets us to understand human nature. I always look at it from a psychology standpoint. What motivated people thousands of years ago still motivates people today. People want resources, they want power, they want to be liked, they want the same things. And if you take a look at history, a lot of the other topics kind of fall into history, like art history, there's literature in history, so you can gather not only what happened in the past, but what kind of motivated people and what inspired people. So instead of looking at a couple things in history, we can look at hundreds of years of people and what makes them tick. So that's what I think it's so important.
Matt?
I think for me, one of, I guess, my big catchphrases has always been knowledge is power. And to me, social studies teaches you to not take everything at face value. We were just talking about it, right? Question everything. And if you take everything at face value, you can be led by
That wouldn't
those.
be the libertarian you speaking out, would it?
I don't know that. I don't know that. But I love going through stories, and even when I taught, especially when I taught Global 1 before, seeing how some groups are controlled just through simple knowledge. And watching, again, going off of Sheena's point, struggling for everybody wants power, right? Well, if you can find a way to use knowledge and gain control of a whole group of people. My favorite part is with social studies, the big question is always, why do we need to learn about a whole bunch of dead guys, right?
Yeah.
Well, the point is that you want to make sure that you see how either people were able to be successful and try to replicate that, or to see why people were unsuccessful and try to avoid doing those same things. And if you don't have at least an understanding, I tell them all the time, we don't need memorization anymore. Google exists for memorization, right? But what we need to learn to understand cause and effect. And social studies, I think, does the best job of using the events of history to show and illustrate cause and effect. Because this happened, these other things happened. And if we want to recreate those results, we need to do things like that. If we want to avoid these results, we need to avoid things like that. And so I think the best part about social studies is it's almost a roadmap for success and failure. And if you don't know those successes and failures, you're going to continue to take those wrong turns.
Mike, your perspective on this?
Well, it's interesting because you talk to folks and they say, especially kids, you talk about...
Actually, Matt has to leave us right now, so thank you, Matt, for giving us the time, and thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll see you guys next month.
All right, see you, Matt. A lot of folks think social studies and think history, and what they don't realize is that social studies encompasses 8 areas
Yes.
in which we're certified to teach, which is economics, history, psychology, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, political science, and geography.
Hold your breath.
Whew. But a lot of folks don't realize, and when you stop and think about all the things that we do in our classroom, we're incorporating all those different things into it. And no offense to the other subjects, but I find it hard to find another content area where there's so much of a shotgun of different topics within a content area to cover. Mm-hmm. I agree with Matt, that whole idea of what makes success and what doesn't. It really, you look at the successful leaders, you look at the powerful leaders, they all have certain qualities and certain innate abilities to be able to do things, or not successful, and things like that. I always focus on the U.S. history and government end, just because it's who I am and what I teach, and I've been teaching U.S. history now for more than 20 years. The young
Almost
people,
as long as I've been alive.
I wasn't going to go there, but yes, that is quite correct. The ability of young people to understand our government, how it has operated, how it's operating now, how it should operate in the future. Young folks have such a very definite vision of what they want things to look like, and how do we get there? You have to know where in order to go someplace, you got to know where you've been and where you are now.
Oh yeah.
And I think that this subject innately leads to that, and hopefully it's going to be a successful thing.
Yeah.
So
Dan.
It's funny, I always get a kick out of it because it seems like, first of all, at open house, granted I've got 26 years in now, but I'm still laughing.
That's as long as I've been alive. Exactly.
I know. I
more than me, I'd like to say.
It's like if I had $1 for every time I saw one of our alumnus somewhere and they came up to me and they said, "Oh man, I didn't really appreciate history so much when I was younger.
Oh my God, yes.
But now I really love it." And it seems like they're always a little bit older. It's almost like history is one of those things that you almost appreciate it the more you get older. Like you don't really see the wisdom and the value in it so much when you're younger, but as you get older, you realize that those people that really have an understanding and a grasp of history, I mean, those are the people that have done some great things and some terribly horrific things too.
Yes.
And so it's funny though that I say to a kid, hey, don't you want to do well in here? You got to get your work done. I don't really like history that much. Same kid, I'll see him 20 years
Yes.
later. Hey, how's it going? Oh, I just wanted to tell you how much I love history now. I know I didn't really like it when I was in your class, but isn't it funny how history does that to people as you get older?
It's that coach you didn't appreciate when you were young,
I think
and then
some,
you like later.
I think some of it comes down to too when folks have families, and
Yeah.
you have kids, and you start talking about with your kids the old family stories, right? My grandfathers both served in World War II.
We should spend an episode.
Yeah,
on
yeah,
it.
that
Just
would be
the
good.
stories
Yeah.
Oh my God, we could
because
sit
we
there.
could
Because
go on and
what-
on.
All right, I'm writing it down.
What makes the thing like his Ellis Island project cool is because it makes a connection for the
They
kid.
love that.
Yeah,
That's what it is.
And when
They
you
love
can
that.
make that connection, that's the thing. And when you're talking with your kids about, my grandparents went through the Great Depression and their experiences were very different. That's a connection that's hard to replicate. And I agree with you 100%. History's either something you love or hate in school. And I found so many times that kids come back later on. It's like, I love learning about it now. I love reading about it. I love talking to my kids about it. So.
Yeah, it's just really interesting.
So my view of it is the fact that I have two perspectives on it. And the first one was really enlightened to me by Dan Carlin. Dan Carlin said this in an episode of his Hardcore History podcast. Would it be awesome if we got like a shout out from him or like send him an email or something? I want to do that because I look at so much of his stuff and I'm really inspired by it. He compared history to a TV series of the human experience, and we're all born into that TV series in whatever season. And if you are born into, let's say season 7, let's say we're in season 7 right now, the human experience, episode 50, I don't know. But you never watched seasons 1 through 6, you're going to be so confused on who is mad at who and why. And I think of like a soap opera, like The Walking Dead. I tell the kids, could you imagine being dropped into The Walking Dead and see, like right now, and you didn't watch the first how many ever seasons, and like you're so confused. And I think it's this, like Sheen, I think you said it. It's the story of us. It's our story, and we certainly don't want to be making those mistakes again. And like Matt and I, everybody kind of touched on it, but to me, that's what I look at. And the other thing too is there's been a lot of work done recently that social studies is the best tool to teach students empathy at a younger age. That ability of to walk another, pardon the phrase, I know it's a really common one, but to walk a mile in somebody else's moccasins. That idea of putting yourself, the perspective piece of history, and how important that really can be. And I think English, you can get it from English a little bit, but I think the ability of, students at that young age when they're so easily, you can mold them, you can, work with them, and they're really impressionable at that age. If they're not learning that kind of stuff until 8th grade, it's just too late, or 7th grade, it's just too late for them to be as impressionable. When they're young, that's the time to really, I think, give them the perspective history. And I think that's, it's lacking. I talked about that in the TED Talk I did, last year, and I think it's lacking in a lot of the younger grade levels, that perspective of history, to really grab onto that. So I think that's one of the bigger pieces that we're definitely missing. So that'll do it for our Pick Your Brain session. Now we're going to get on to our questions. And I think since we opened the questions, we got a ton of questions, by the way, some really good ones.
Let's do it.
And I think we've really been waiting for this segment in the show. So we had a lot emailed in. We had, I think, a total of 5 questions emailed in. And mind you, we only announced this podcast last week. So, and I can't wait to get our Twitter feed and see what that's going to be like once people can tweet questions at us.
Awesome.
Sheena looks excited. But we got to get the Twitter. I'm going to say it like right now. I don't care if it gets put on YouTube in the final show. We got to get unblocked at our school. For us to do that, but not for the kids, just for the teachers, because we want to have live questions come in.
Right.
I mean, like they're not listening to the show live, but we could stream live to YouTube if we wanted.
could.
It's just like an extra process. But let's get to our questions here. So this comes from John Heiss, a member of our school board, actually. He emailed pretty quickly. Which president had the strongest leadership style? Now, I want to point this out. Some of these questions, they're more structured to global for some people. Some are structured more to U.S. So you'll hear, like Sheena might not jump in on this. She's a global person, right? There's nothing wrong with that. She was a little nervous at first about doing that, but there's questions that lend themselves to certain people. There's one coming up about Gandhi that I'm not going to be very well versed to answer, that I'm going to need Sheena's help on big time. So which president the strongest leadership style? So let's. Anyone want to take a venture first?
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Andrew Jackson.
Oh man!
Certainly
oh my gosh!
not
I'm
the
not even.
most.
I'm completely.
Certainly
oh my
not the
gosh.
most popular president, and certainly committed atrocities against Native
Sure,
Americans.
sure. Yeah, but it's
Certainly
leadership style. Yeah.
held kangaroo court against British soldiers at the end of the War of
He did.
1812.
Yes.
But when it comes to being a take charge kind of person,
Okay.
he was a take charge kind of person.
All right.
He was willing to clear the cabinet. He was willing to bring in his own friends. He was a true, one of those guys that is going to do it his way, right or wrong.
Okay.
And it doesn't surprise me they're going to take him off the bill at some point.
It's funny you say that because I've likened Trump to Jackson.
Oh.
Because whether you love him or hate him, he's convinced he's right. I guess
smart, yeah.
I'm not going to go the way of Jackson. I'm probably going to take the easy way out, but that's okay. And I think Washington, hands down, probably the biggest challenges, and I think it kind of gets kind of gets glossed over. Being the first president in a republic in which they're
you took
making
mine. I was
things
gonna
up.
watch- yeah.
Well, I mean, they're making
No,
things up as they go along.
He's drawing the map.
He's drawing the map. He's dealing with a cabinet that is
Well, it's like first for a group presentation.
right.
It's
To say it's a fractured group is putting it mildly. I mean, Hamilton and Jefferson alone are a handful. I can't even imagine
That's
having them like
putting
in a
it
classroom.
lightly. That's
right.
putting it
I mean,
lightly.
seriously, you have two guys who can't even agree upon the time of day, and you're trying to mold a new country using these great minds. And I do think they're great minds in different ways. But how do you do that in a way that is that's going to save the country and be effective?
Right. So even though Mike took mine, I definitely say Washington because he's the first and all that. But also he puts people around him purposefully. You can see this in his military career. He surrounds himself with who he thinks are the best people. He takes their ideas. But at the end of the day, he's still the one to make the call. I think it's a great thing, and that's where I would criticize Jackson a little bit. He's going to go with his thing no matter what. Washington's willing to listen to everybody, kind of be the last to speak, but he's always going to have the final say no matter what. He's willing to hear the criticism almost. And I was going to bridge this to Lincoln, the team of rivals thing, and he's going to put people in the cabinet that disagree with him. Some of those were for political reason, Andrew Johnson. But the ability to surround yourself with people who disagree with you, who know more than you, you're okay with them knowing more than you, and that's why they're there. And the ability to recognize brilliance in other people besides yourself and use them to make things better is a wonderful leadership quality because there's some humility in it to know that you don't know everything.
That's a rare leadership quality too.
I would say that I think you can count on one hand the number. I think that's something we all strive to do, but at the end of the day, when we get criticized or when somebody criticizes us, it's really tough to still act as a positive leader. So Dan had to step out. We now welcoming Mike Votri to the show. Mike, you teach at Alternative High School.
Yes.
And Mike is probably the guy that teaches the most variety of things. So, that's going to be a really interesting perspective we can always bring in. So, Mike, which president had the strongest leadership style?
See, I don't look at it historically. I look at it from what I know, like nothing that I've read in a book or things like that. I look at first person. The very first president I can remember wanting to watch would be somebody like Bill Clinton, who had to go through so many things, scandals, a war, different things going on in the country, and he had to lead with things in the press and other things going on without, just somebody writing it down and then you read about it. You actually get to see it firsthand. Mm-hmm. So for me, leadership style, I always wanted to vote for him and believed everything that he said. And I think as a president, that's how you lead the country.
Mm-hmm. Especially in the modern sense, too. Mike, you're smiling from ear to ear right now. You got to add something. Come on, to go by.
I wouldn't necessarily believe everything Clinton said, but...
But you were also a different age than him.
Yeah.
Yes,
That's
no,
why
absolutely.
I think it's
But
important.
when he said something,
Right.
even, whatever
Even
happened
when he pointed
with
at the camera and said, I did not have...
you
Just
knew
saying.
he might have done something with that girl. But guess what? You still believed he didn't do anything.
Sure. No,
Or
I mean...
his
So-
leadership style, like, I was still gonna lead people, and people are still gonna,
Believability.
yes.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Buy what you're selling.
even if you take sports, like, a coach might not say,
Yeah.
like, you are the best player, and tell a player he's the best player, and that player is willing to follow them.
Yep.
That's
Buy-in.
leadership.
I will begrudgingly give Clinton credit. I mean, he dealt with a Republican Congress that was not
Very
exactly,
well, too.
and not a Republican Congress that was easy to deal with. But it's interesting because he's more of a centrist, you know, and
Yeah.
I think that's interesting because
Something we're lacking now.
It's interesting
Yes.
because now we have people on the right or the left, and to me that you bring it more center, that's when you're going to get a whole lot more done.
Oh yeah.
People might have disagreed with him, but they disagreed on, like, issues, not the whole person.
Mhm.
Like,
Yep.
he kind of,
Yep.
everybody was willing to get behind him and follow him.
Yep. Sheena, you want to get involved in this one?
Well, American history isn't my area of expertise, and I didn't really study a lot of the details about the presidents. I almost want to say FDR just to stir things up with.
Yeah, you know that's gonna go.
Because he had fireside chats.
But
very
no,
relatable.
you can't
Nice.
deny those things. You can't deny his leadership on that.
Expanded the government to help the people, which I know we
Oh,
all like.
yeah. Well, I mean, she's saying that because Matt's not here either. So she's
True.
poking.
I should've
She's poking the
brought up that.
libertarians in the room. Go ahead. What were you saying? Sorry.
Oh no, I'm pretty much it.
Okay.
Well, according to my grandmother, FDR walked on water.
There's a lot of
Yeah.
people that.
I mean,
would
yeah,
agree
and
with
she,
that.
but she
Yeah.
listened to Fireside Chat. She was
Yeah.
inspired by that.
I think there's parallels to Clinton on that a little bit.
It's fun. I just did the history and film.
Yeah.
And one of the films that we watched was Cinderella
Oh,
Man.
great choice. Yep.
And his friend there, Mike.
He's got that scene. Yeah.
Yeah, where there's that contingent of people that don't want to follow him, and they believe in organizing and unionizing and almost that communist view where, like, you know, the
Which is
rich still have everything, and there was a fraction of people that were against Roosevelt.
Yep.
If you watch that, that scene and go back a
Yeah.
little bit.
There's a great scene in there where he's walking down the street and there's a beautiful, luxurious car
Yeah,
that pulls
yeah.
up. Family gets out, walks out with presents, and the kid's got a big old round lollipop
Yep.
like they used to have.
Yeah.
But I love that the fact that they're demonstrating that things are not good for everybody, but there are some who are
Yes.
doing okay.
Yes. In that the opposition to the Depression wasn't Mike, you brought that up. The opposition to FDR during the Depression is, there's the Republican opposition who is what you're doing is socialism. That you expect to be there. The opposition you expect to be there. But the opposition does not get talked about enough. It's Huey Long, right? The Huey Long opposition. Share the wealth. That doesn't get discussed. It didn't go far enough.
Yeah, that's not. Yeah, the New Deal isn't going far
enough.
Francis Townsend,
Yes.
wanting to give the folks who are retired $200 a week.
Yes.
Which is like 4 times what the average person was getting in a pension at that point.
Yeah.
That
doesn't get discussed
No, not
enough.
at all. Not at all.
And I think when when you're critical of FDR, my political background makes me critical of FDR, of course. But as I studied the guy longer and I looked at him, like, he was super concerned with deficit spending, and which is why he rolls the New Deal back in 1936 and 7, and the economy slumps again, because it was almost like holding the chin out of somebody drowning in the water, and you let go of that before there's any real economic stimulus. It slumps back into depression.
Right.
So, it's interesting to think that there's more opposition than you think in different ways to that.
And the other point that he tries to do an end round around the Constitution by
Oh, don't give
packing
me
the court.
yeah, here we go. Yeah. If you
I'm
keep bringing
just
that up,
saying-
I'm going to be here all day.
I'm just saying, you just can't completely eliminate it from the history.
No, and he got Congress to unite on something.
Right. Even the Democrats.
Even the Democrats like, bro,
That's too far.
that's too much, man. That's too much.
Way to go, Sheedy. Stir the
Yeah.
pot on that one.
So Kelly Frost, one of our colleagues here, submitted 2 questions, and Kelly, we're going to skip over your FDR one because we just had that discussion. But this one is interesting, and she asked, "Is it true Gandhi was a bad guy?" First of all, there's some Sheena, get ready. There's some limitations to the question. Obviously, like saying in history, as historians, we're careful when we say bad and good.
Right.
Because of how we judge the times, and do we want to judge through modern eyes? Mike is already, his gears are turning, there's smoke coming out of his ears. Careful, you're at the age now where that might have permanent damage.
Thank you.
Sheena, go ahead. You take the Gandhi question away.
I think that Gandhi kind of teaches an important lesson in history. We kind of teach things. We talk about the big parts of a person historically, and sometimes we we see people as heroes because we talk about all the good that they did and the policies, and of course he was fighting for independence in India and the Salt March and all those things where he used civil disobedience. We talk about those a lot in class. But I have students sometimes ask me, like, isn't it true that he was mean? Didn't he beat his wife? And things like that pop up. And then we have to look at people as human beings.
Yep.
In Gandhi's autobiography, he admitted to some of those things. He said that he dragged his wife out of the house one time, and he admitted to hitting her. There's also criticism of him as far as being almost a racist by some, because when he was in South Africa working, he would not want to be classified as the natives. He would want to make sure that the Indian people were seen as above that. But you have to kind of separate, and I think in history we always have to teach kids to say, okay, this is what they did publicly, but we can't say they're perfect or they're heroes.
They're people.
Which is interesting,
and
you
they're
bring up that whole
reflection of
racism thing, because
Yeah.
we don't think of racism as being, it's always white
Right,
or
yeah.
Western Europe or America
Oh, yeah.
against, and that's such an interesting idea of Indians being racist with South Africans.
Right.
You know,
Yes.
racism is an issue on every continent.
Well, it's like judging somebody in the context of their times.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, because right now we're going through
Yeah.
this with the Confederate monuments, and a lot of people are saying
Yeah.
is if we rip those down, where does it stop? You know, type of thing. And a lot of people have retorted, because some people ask, and I think it's a good question to ask. You know, if we rip these down, does it mean George Washington's next or Thomas Jefferson? Does owning slaves alone mean that you're going to get your monument ripped down? And you know, similar to Gandhi, if you judge him in the context of times, people have responded with, no, they betrayed their country and fought for a nation to preserve the ownership of people. You know, so I think that they've said, well, that's what the line is, right there. But, I mean, Mike, do you want to discuss that point?
Well,
I don't want to bring it, do want to bring it back to Gandhi, though, at some point here.
I've been in my Global 10 class. We just started doing imperialism and things like that, and a lot of the religious aspects are kind of overlooked too, like what was going on with the Hindus and the Muslims.
Yes,
and nowadays you look at like Pakistan and India, like he kind of there wasn't a lot of tolerance for the Muslims. Like he worked with the Muslims,
Sure.
but so to that they were working together.
But it was a means to an end.
I
Right.
always think in the back of his mind he thought that, all right, we'll figure out a solution. We'll give them their land, we'll take ours. And it almost seems like he kind of thought the Hindus were above the Muslims, even when studying it, or even you watch the movie, like the interaction between the Muslims and the Hindus, you know.
Let me throw out some food for thought, just to get people to think, as I usually do. Does Gandhi use the people as pawns to achieve what he
man.
wants? Because it's easy to talk about civil disobedience, but you're convincing people to go out there and literally put themselves physically on the line, and that's okay. But there's a cost to that. Same criticisms were made of Martin Luther King when they brought the kids in, and they involved the kids in the movement, and saying that you're using the youth as a pawn. Isn't Gandhi using the lower class as pawns? So I could make the argument, if I had to, that he's not necessarily a great guy. In the bigger context, though, I do think that the good outweighs the bad.
Right, exactly.
But again, human beings, flawed character.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to use people as pawns to get what you want. And same thing can be said about any historical movement, whether it's the labor movement or anything else.
I was going to say, with Washington, Jefferson, these are people, and any of the founding fathers, a lot of them, these are people who we revere, did great things. We look at them in a very respectful light. But at the end of the day, they took part in slavery. In our modern context, that is a major. I keep bringing it back to the U.S. This is because what I know. So it's hard to classify them as good or bad. They're people, and they are merely a reflection of their time. They're normal humans, while they have done great things, and that's so hard for kids to understand too. Sheena, do you want any final thoughts, kind of on that, the Gandhi, the bad guy thing? I mean, I think there's that component too of a lot of the what was the one point that she discussed with me at one time, Kelly? Oh, like the sexual components of Gandhi too. Like that's also some of the touchy stuff I think people talk about.
I think people get into it because that's like the hidden secrets. Like, I
Yes.
didn't know that.
Yeah,
and
it's
they
a
wanna
conspiracy
dig up
almost,
stuff
where
about
they're-
him being a hypocrite and things like that. So, yeah, I think that that he was extremely sexually repressed, and he
Yes.
had some odd personal characteristics. And obviously, as a female, I don't agree with his view on women during that time at all.
Exactly.
So I would definitely,
Yeah.
I might bring that up because part of what I try to do is focus on humans
Yep.
in history and how, you know, their personalities
point.
played a role in what they did.
Mhm.
So I'll bring it up, but yeah, we have to talk about, like Mike said, it doesn't negate it, and it's like
It doesn't
the
negate
good
what they
outweigh
did.
the bad.
Exactly.
Yes.
Everybody's kind of on a scale,
Yeah.
I guess you could say.
Agree with that.
Are we good with Gandhi? Do we want to move on to our next one? I think we have final thoughts. Okay. This one's from Connor Kaminsky from our World Wars class. I was super excited to answer this question, but actually, there's one that I was under the pile that I missed. Came from a student. Who's older, Mrs. Monks or Mr. Christman?
Oh.
Somebody actually wrote that question in there.
That is awesome.
We're not going to debate this, but it's just
That's
good
a
to
question
see
for the ages.
the
that
feud is alive
bad.
and well at Holley. Mrs. Monk, somebody teaches Spanish here, and they've always argued back and forth with quotes. And it's if you are in the Holley building, you know of this feud, and people do take part
I think
in
it
it.
made the yearbook. Or
It
something,
did.
didn't
They were
It
best
did.
best
Yeah.
feud, right?
Yes, yes.
Best
Yeah.
feud.
Yeah.
The Connor Kaminsky question though, and I can't wait. I didn't tell you about that question, Mike, on purpose before
That's
the show.
I'm not going to respond to it because I was taught to have respect for my elders.
Yes, yes. If Connor Kaminsky's question, this is totally motivated by our World Wars class because Connor's in it. If Germany fell to communism after World War I, how would it have been different than fascism, or what actually happened? Would Hitler be part of a communist Germany? Because, you know, Germany has a large population of socialists and communists in Europe at the time. It's a major concern. And not just Germany. Britain has these concerns. The United States has these concerns. There's the revolution in Russia. This is an alive and well question. And I don't think it's a what-if one, which we caution students away. But I don't think it's a far-fetched what-if question at all. I think it's a very valid one. Karl Marx was German. I mean, he thought that if it was going to happen, it would happen in a country like Germany.
We talked about in our section of World Wars where there's actually a higher percentage of communists in Germany than there is in Russia. So it's not a far-fetched stretch to imagine Germany becoming a communist country. I don't know if Hitler would have gone for that. Although...
Because he ties communism to Bolshevism.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, not communism, Bolshevism. Judaism
Right.
to Bolshevism and communism. I totally
Right.
messed that up.
No, that's all right. I don't know if Hitler would have fallen in with that. I do think... I mean, you look at the history of any communist country where communism really takes hold, there are purges. You know, I mean, just... so in the end, it's not going to be good for that country. But I don't think Hitler would get involved with that. It would be interesting to know, would he leave Austria then and come to Germany and become an influential member? I don't know. Would the communists have crushed him along with any other resistance? So I don't know. It's a good
Mike's
question.
been like, he's
he's
chomping
See,
a bit.
I was always taught when I was in college, like, there's a separation between, communism is an economic system,
Yes.
and you're talking about a political system,
Yep.
more in fascism, things like that.
Yep.
So the combination of both of them,
Yep.
to me, like...
The dictatorship and communism, you mean?
like, you can have a dictatorship and a communist economic system.
Absolutely.
So
It just so happens that communism typically is delivered through...
And I think it could work. If he was the dictator and could run everything, almost like a Stalin,
Sure.
I think he would let communism.
Yeah.
And be like, all right, have your purges. Let's get rid of the people. I think Hitler was all about ego. And if he could keep his power through having communism, I think he would have been fine with that.
Mm-hmm.
Without a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more interested in what I don't myself, I'm inclined to agree with Mike. I don't know if Hitler would have been part of it. Crispin, that is. That's going to get
It's
confusing.
going to
Oh,
get confusing.
yeah.
I don't know if Hitler would have been part of it because, he talks about Mein Kampf with, like, he's tying communism to Judaism right away. And I don't know, but you're right. Maybe his ideology evolves. Maybe Mein Kampf is just he throws it out. You're right.
Things you write in your 20s while you're in jail.
That's what I'm saying. Yes.
He
Right.
doesn't know anything about that.
No,
Yeah,
I'm in my 20s now. I've never been to jail, but I am in my 20s.
In your 20s while you're in jail, you're going to write down a lot of things.
Sure.
And when you're 50 years old, let's say, and you're trying to maintain power and your ego, and you've controlled this for so long,
Yeah.
your thoughts might change.
He gravitated towards that Ludendorff camp after the war. The German army could have won. We were stabbed in the back by
Right.
those socialist communists. So, I mean, that was the way he went. But I'm more interested in what a communist Germany looks like. Could you imagine this setup we have in the world. If Germany goes to communism in the 20s, and then you have Russia, who was already on their way there.
Boy, if you thought the Red Scare was big in the
Right.
United States to begin with,
Well, because
that would have pushed
Germany's
us over the
at the
edge.
time, Germany's got the industrial power to really throw their weight around Europe. More so, Russia needed that time in the 20s, early 30s to sort of get their way there, I guess you could say.
So then, does Britain fall to communism as well? Because there's a huge,
Yeah,
there's
and
a
they have problems in the
huge
20s.
communist socialist movement.
Peaky
in Britain.
Blinders fans out there, which is a show I watch,
Yeah.
they're always coming up with socialists and the communists. I don't know what a communist Germany in Europe would have looked like after World War I, but the world would be very different.
Yeah.
I don't think we can say what it would look like, but it'd be different. Sheena, did you want to get in this one at all?
Well, I think there's going to be a trend with these podcasts that I'm a slow processor, and I'm like the student that likes wait time. So I really have to think about that a little bit more before I inferred what would happen.
Yeah,
You guys
I
have
think
good
saying
points.
I don't know is like totally fine because
Yeah.
I have no idea what this is going to look like.
Well, let me put in a shameless plug for alternate history, because this is something I've been checking out. There's a author by the name of Harry Turtledove who's written a couple of series of books, and they're awesome. And the first series started off with a book called How Few Remain, and it basically takes the idea of what happened if the Confederacy actually won the Civil War.
Oh my
Confederacy
gosh.
becomes a real country, and then he takes it in a series of books through World War I and into World War II, where the United States is actually allied with Germany, industrial Germany, industrial United States, and the Confederacy is allied with France and France and Britain, and then even into World War II, that alliance still stays the same.
I could even see that ethnic makeup of how the country is
Oh,
split
yeah.
up. Germany being part of the Midwest,
And he does a fantastic job
Yeah.
of being able to tie that all together. And then he has another series that's really kind of out there, because he's also a science fiction writer, where in the middle of World War II, the United States is attacked by aliens.
oh my
And
gosh.
so all these factions have been fighting each other. So Stalin and FDR
Yeah.
and Tojo, they all have to work together.
Oh my gosh.
It totally shameless plug for
No,
Harry
you're-
Turtledove, but just kind of an interesting idea. And there's been some historical works. Ambrose wrote a book.
Yep.
Stephen Ambrose, one of my favorite authors, got involved with a book about historical fiction. What if D-Day failed? So there's some great questions out there. Real tipping points is what could have
Well, I
happened.
think that's a good segue, kind of, because we got a lot of questions here, and some of these are really deep questions we have from students, but some of them are geeky questions that we asked when we were 12, 13 years old, and we don't want to shy away from those. We told the kids, hey, give us what you really want to know, and we'll try the best to discuss and answer it. And we might think that they're kind of low ball questions, his professional historians might look at them as oh, come on, really, we're going to talk about this, it's not real history. We're not going to shy away from that. We're going to discuss it. So this one is on its way to that, but I think our next one is definitely going to get towards it. But this question is, what job was more dangerous during World War I? Working on a U-boat or digging tunnels? I would have to say that I think, that's tough. U-boat casualty rates are crazy.
They're in the 30s.
30%. I wonder what we haven't looked at tunnel digging.
No.
Though. I would have to. I'm going to go with the U-boat, because digging the tunnels, if you don't run into the other opposing side, or the artillery shells doesn't force a cave in, I would have to go with the U-boat, because if they don't hit your tunnel, if they don't have that troglodyte fight there underground, the cave-in doesn't happen, you're relatively safe compared to the rest of your guys. U-boats, you're in trouble. If you're in one of those U-boats that has to surface and the merchant ship has a gun on it, you are toast.
Or something happens and something fails, and you run too deep.
Exactly.
And you get crushed.
There's a way out of the tunnel. There's no way out of the
Right,
U-boat.
yeah.
I've just been watching the news about the Argentinian. So
Yeah,
that's been interesting, yeah.
And I just keep on thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, they say that you got 2 weeks of food and water, and they've been missing for 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still trying to find them, and you're underwater, and
Yeah.
And you would think in 2017, a
Yeah.
submarine wouldn't lose contact.
so I can't even think and fathom back then.
And those submarines are just,
Yeah.
it's a tin can.
Yep.
Good Lord.
Mike, what would you say on that one?
U-boat, in my
U-boat.
mind, no doubt. Just the size, the problems of, there's gasoline and oil everywhere in one of those U-boats. If you're if you're semi-claustrophobic, good luck.
Yeah, I couldn't do it. Couldn't do it.
And there's so much working against you. And you think too, I mean, the World War I U-boats don't have heaters in them at all.
No.
So here you are in the North Atlantic where it's freaking cold to begin with,
Yeah.
and you have nothing but water around you, just chilling that
Good
thing
luck.
down. Yeah,
Good luck.
surviving.
Our next question comes from Liam Anderson. He's a huge Dan Carlin fan.
Shout out to Liam.
Huge Dan Carlin fan. And this question is something that Dan Carlin talked about on his podcast, Romancing the Tribes, how humans have a natural attachment to the romanticism of like the noble savage and tribal life. And Liam, you got 6 questions here, man. We're picking one today. Some of these are going to be whole shows, bud. They're great questions. Which tribal group, Native Americans, Germanics, Celts, was the most historically intimidating? This is one of those our geek questions. And which one of these groups would you say was the most successful? Man, I like this question a lot. Dividing the Germanics and Celts are tough. Is there somebody he left off of this?
So it can be anybody?
No, you could. No, it says etc. So you can be anybody.
So.
I'm inclined to stick to one of these. Well, for me, if it's the tribal group, they got to be at a disadvantage. Do you understand what I'm saying? They got to be at the disadvantage. There's got to be somebody more developed than them. That's kind of what I think the question implies.
Can they start and then
Yeah, I
Because
think
that's the whole...
Yeah, or does it have to be in the time? This is tough.
Because I always go with the Mongols.
See, I was thinking that. I don't think you can go with the Mongols because they literally have technology that's better than the people around them.
But they didn't start
But
with
they didn't
that.
start that way. They started as a steppe people.
They started as
If
nomadic people.
If you wanted to say the steppe people, I think that's a justifiable
But if
answer.
you want to start with
But
the
I don't
Mongols,
think you can say the
it's just
Mongols.
nomadic, and then we're just going to go over and roll in and take over people, and
Yeah.
then steal the technology and enslave them, so we can just keep going up.
I don't, like I said, I think if you said the steppe people, like if you go all the way back to the Scythians and those people, drinking your enemy, using their skull as a mug, as the Scythians like to do. I think you'd have to go. I think you do. I think you get this. I don't think you say the Mongols themselves. I think you say the steppe people if you're going to go that route.
Intimidating wise, I'd say the Aztecs.
Yeah,
That's
sure.
what I was going to mention. Yeah, no, that's a good
Sheena,
point.
go ahead.
No, I just think that some of the stuff that you hear about the Aztecs with like human sacrifice and how they, prisoners of war they use for human sacrifice, just that imagery and the power that they had with building allies with those around them, as far as the successful piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, sacrificing people to the sun god is just, it's an absolutely terrifying idea. It's interesting, and the question is a tricky one because the Aztecs at their height are not a small power. They are the power in Central America, but as they develop that, I think that's Mike Botry. I think that's where you were going with the Mongols because they start off as this smaller nomadic,
Going from town to town, and
right,
then later
and then
on,
it builds into something.
Yeah.
Although and I wonder too how much like the Germanic and Celts are romanticized in movies. I mean, you look at things like Gladiator or Braveheart.
And our Western view colors that.
Oh yeah,
there's no doubt about that.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna be the Western guy here. I'm gonna say it's the Germanic peoples. Native American history's always been a fascination of mine, but I gotta go with the Germanic peoples because if you look at what they brought down the Roman Empire at the end of the day, and you can argue as to what the Roman Empire was at that time. The first experience, obviously, again, Dan Carlin, harken back to him, the Teutons and the Cimbri, when they roll in, or just before the just before the turn from AD to BC, or BC to AD, excuse me, just before the times of Caesar and everything, the Teutons and the Cimbris roll in, and they scare the bejesus out of the Romans, and they do quite a bit of damage. But at the end of the day, at the end of the Roman Empire, the Germans bring it down. The Germanic tribes bring it down. But then
they bring down a weekend.
But they still did it.
And they're
But they
able
still
to
did it.
regroup and go to the Byzantine and kind of just move down a little bit.
true.
So is that really bringing down an empire if they just kind of move down the coast and say, take that? And
I still think they bring down the empire, yeah.
And we're going to the good part of the Mediterranean and we still have control of trade.
And the way they brought it down was they essentially became Roman, like were the Romans. But yeah, the steppe people are up there for me. They got to be up there. And then I would probably put the Germanic people. Even the difference between Germanic and Celt, how's that? Come on. There's a historian that wrote, you're Celtic if you think you're Celtic. because it's so broad. And what's the difference between a Germanic person and a Celt? Like, you know, and that whole argument. But I think that's a good spot to sort of transition to our next question there, because we got to get to one like this. Like this is a typical question we expect for this show, and our kids are so fascinated by it. And I think I don't think it's a bad question. You know, who's a worse dictator, Hitler or Joseph Stalin? It's a fun question. And some professional historians might roll their eyes at it, so do we a little bit, but it's still fun. Sheena, you want to start this one off? Or do you want that processing time? Or
Yeah, come back to me.
Mike,
yeah.
go ahead.
Wow.
Again, how do we define worse? It's like good or bad? Is that
yes?
yes to both?
All right, so I'll say Hitler, with the only caveat that Stalin's actually working with the Allies during World War II.
Yeah.
But, I mean, in
Evil
the end,
empire versus evil empire.
well, it's the enemy. My enemy is my friend.
Yes.
And they were working together until Hitler invades. So I mean, I guess neither one is good.
Well, on the invading point, how about like Stalin trusting Hitler and like not believing the reports are true?
Well, I was gonna say, and
The
there were
most-
reports all over the
the
border.
most paranoid guy
Yeah.
trusting the one guy you can't trust.
And then goes and purges his generals because you didn't give me enough information, and then that really
Well,
leads
he even
to
purged him before that on top of it too.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
So I mean, I guess Hitler is the worst simply because Stalin's actually working with the Allies for a while, but in the end, he's not any better. But
Mike, Poetry.
I have a difficult time answering
I do
this.
too.
I agree with Mr. Chrisman about, Stalin at least worked with the Allies. However, I'm not saying either one was good, they were both bad, but where they got their countries and what was their goal through doing this, like if you look at the Soviet Union prior to communism and what he was trying to do, and then he had to do these things, and then Hitler during World War I, and then has to do these things.
Yeah.
It's almost like you can't, like good and bad is like a judgment, like in that time period.
Hitler gets him out of the Depression.
Yes,
Nice.
he gets him out.
Just throwing it out there. I'm gonna have to defend it.
But on the justice scale, that's like a pebble.
Yeah,
and then like
exactly, right.
the Holocaust, the other end is like
Yeah.
a massive rock that breaks everything, right?
I would have to say Hitler because of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
If we were just saying,
It's the systematic nature of the whole
Yes.
thing, and that
The Ukrainians might have something to say about
and
that.
I was just gonna come back with
or
that.
like there's some countries in Africa. that
But-
might-
Well,
Exactly.
but also with that whole thing is with the Ukrainian piece, there are historians that will argue you to the teeth that the Ukrainian incident was not a genocide. You know,
Just like
And
Armenians, right?
I know, just like the Armenians. Yeah, I know historians who will argue that the Ukrainian thing, and they go the same way with Mao. You know, that it was always it was a consequence of his flawed policies, and it was not intentional. I don't agree with that. I had a politics of genocide professor in college who called that for what it was, and totally disagreed. My perspective on this, God, this is a tough decision for me. This is like rooting for Ohio
It's such a
State
tough
or like
one.
the Dolphins. I don't know. This is so hard for me.
Maybe you could root for a winner.
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, insert college football joke here.
All right, Ms. Hammer, what do you got to say about this? Come on.
I think that if you broke it into for the worse for the world or worse for their country, I don't know,
Ooh.
Hitler, if you put it in terms of like what he did
Yeah.
with World War II, and obviously the Holocaust is absolutely horrible. Like maybe
Yeah.
he's the more evil person.
That's it. Yeah.
But Stalin ruled for so long
And
and
body
mistreated
count.
the people for so long. The numbers were so high.
Yes.
And was sending people to the Gulag and you know what he did in the
His
Ukraine,
own
the
daughter-in-law.
forced starvation. It seems like for his own country he
Yeah,
really
yeah.
was.
I would have to go with Hitler, I think, probably, but I mean, it's like a inch. I mean, Stalin is, and the whole communism attachment too, it makes it even rougher. I bet if Karl Marx could see how Stalin got to implement his ideas, and Lenin too, I think he would be really upset because a lot of the ways he implemented it was not what he had planned. That's not me saying though that Stalin was a guy that had good intentions. I don't know if Stalin ever had good intentions. There's a story of him as a young man swimming through like a flooded river, and there's a calf out in this island, a young calf. It's like bleeding and crying, and he swims out to it, and like the natural thing would be like to rescue it, bring it back to the shore. He breaks all 4 of his legs and comes back. And this was, I mean, that was an account of a friend that he had in his early years that this happened. But that's the kind of guy you're dealing with there. So, I mean, that's a tough question.
We talk in psychology as him being an example of a psychopath. Like everything.
Yeah,
does it's just mentally.
He's missing empathy.
unstable.
He's missing some
Yes.
things. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. So this one comes from Shane Klimchuk. Mike's laughing because Crispin, that is. Wow, that's going to be tough. Again, do you have a problem or dislike of the talk of changing Andrew Jackson off of the $20 bill?
All right, so just to preface the question, this came out of a discussion we were having about Jackson in our class. And I had mentioned that, there's this discussion about taking Jackson off the currency. And some students felt it was ridiculous. Who cares? Who cares who's on the currency?
There's an empathy piece.
Well, and I prefaced my comment by saying I want you not to take offense to this, but as a white guy, isn't that easy for you to say? Considering the fact that there's no minority on any printed bills, and there are no women. And I'm proud of my class. They didn't take it personally, but I was just trying to get them to think about, maybe is it time to rethink some of those things?
Yeah. Who you pay
personally,
tribute to, who you honor.
Personally, I think it is time to rethink some of those. In Jackson's, certainly our historiography of Jackson, from hero to villain to hero to villain, has changed over the years.
And you rethink. I want to point this out for people listening because Mike's pointing out, rethinking those things. Mike's political background and opinions, you wouldn't expect him to say that, I guess. Right? You would
not usually, yeah.
His answer there, rethinking those things, you expect of somebody of the left, the very far left, and that's not the case. And I think that's where as historians we transcend the political spectrum. Our opinions of this stuff is not influenced by our political beliefs. We're able to separate the two.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I was in the 90s when there was this push towards what was referred to as revisionist history.
Yes.
Was seen as necessarily a bad thing. I don't necessarily think it's bad to reframe the way we look at things.
It doesn't mean you have to agree with it.
No, it doesn't mean you have to agree with it.
Perspective.
And it doesn't mean that Jackson was, and certainly Jackson has problems, but he also has a lot of positives to him as well. And it would be no different than talking about let's take Lincoln off of some of the currency. Let's take Washington off some of the currency. You would have way more pushback on that because there's way easier to make the argument and vilify Jackson. But I do think at some point we do need to re-examine this because our currency does promote our values. Look at any
monument,
Look at any country's currency. Look at Canada's. Look at Mexico's. Look at any country.
Canada's. It's so confusing to me.
But they're trying to push their values, their nationalistic intentions, the leaders who they think are great. And I think we've come such a long way that it's time to start maybe reevaluating that stuff.
Mike,
see, the whole Stonewall Jackson, and he was a good leader. I've never viewed him to that side. Like when you talk about Stalin and Hitler, like good and bad, like I believe we really got to examine Jackson from the bad, and then.
You mean Andrew, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Just because, the whole thing with the Native Americans and, things he did while president. And I think those things get overlooked. And then you put him on money, and it's like you're supposed to, like Native Americans basically look at him as this bad person.
There's some Native Americans that often, people will joke that they won't get their checks in 20s.
Yeah, I've met Native Americans that will not accept $20 bills.
Yep.
Like they just think it's offensive if you try to give them one.
I also think, and this is credit to my professor Michael Oberg at Geneseo, he talks about how we focus so much on the Trail of Tears, but we don't discuss the removal of Iroquois peoples from New York. We don't discuss we have so much cherry-picked a lot of history, and that's not true of just Native Americans. We've cherry-picked what we want to talk about and how we want to talk about it in general. And I think as Native, this is from Professor Oberg as well, a lot of times we teach, especially the elementary levels you see it, is Native Americans as people of the past. Like they just don't exist anymore. They drop. I pulled it. I teach Native Americans the assimilation piece in 8th grade. I pick up the textbook and I go to the back and I say, okay, let's look at the index of where Native Americans pop up. And after
chapter 1?
And after a certain page, it stops because the last time they pop up really is the assimilation piece, and they get like a slight shout out in the '60s with civil rights, with the American Indian movement and stuff like that, and then it drops off. My answer to that question is I agree with everything Mike Christman said. I think it's got to be reevaluated along with a lot of other things.
I think that'd be interesting to pose this question to students and to see how relevant it would be or how interested in it they would be, because I feel like a lot of our kids are not even going to use a lot of currency. It's going to be
they haven't
credit
dealt
card
with it yet.
swiping.
Yeah.
They're not gonna have a lot of
the
like,
electronic
feelings about
age.
it. I'm just thinking about the kids.
That's a good point.
Bitcoins.
Because
Yeah,
no, I mean really.
a lot of things is PayPal.
PayPal,
It's
yeah.
just choose your credit
How
card.
many of us
So
have
how
paid
much
cash
honors-
recently?
Yeah,
I'll be
right.
honest with you, as the young guy in the room, I like to point out the young guy in the room. I don't use cash a lot. My father picks on me all the time, like, "Oh, those people don't use cash." That's a really good point. I didn't even think of looking at. This brings us to our last question, and this one is from my 8th grade classroom because we do an essay on this. This is our last question for the day. Did African Americans really gain their freedom during the Reconstruction era? And mine is a resounding no. The reason that this is from Ethan Adzinski, thank you, buddy, shows me you were listening in class. We examined 12 primary sources, secondary sources on this question. And the students, many of them acknowledge, yes, the 13th Amendment did end slavery. So in some sense they had freedoms, but what did freedom mean? And most students come to the end after examining the sources that personally, yes, they were able to leave, start families, and kind of do it in that way. But so in the personal life, that might have meant freedom, but it did not mean freedom in their economic life. And the two often overlap. Things like sharecropping. They weren't able to exercise themselves economically. And when the troops leave the South and the KKK and white supremacists sort of start to take control, things the Southerners, from that perspective, that group anyways, not all Southerners, but that white supremacist group, try to get it as close to slavery as humanly possible, and that's where you end up. So you kind of have to define what freedom is in that sense before you answer the question, but my answer would be no.
I think it's an astounding no.
Yeah.
Like if you
I don't think it's close.
If you look at the South, if you look at job opportunities, if you look at how much people made even in the North, African Americans compared to whites, if you look at the military,
That's the thing. It's not just a Southern disease.
Yes,
it's an American. It's a global disease.
Yes.
It's a human disease. Yes.
It's across the United States.
Yeah. And people see this as like an exclusively United States thing, and it's not. We just in World Wars we're talking about. George Clemenceau in 1918 says, "I would rather have 10 Africans die than one Frenchman on the front lines," and that's in France, who people often say, "Oh, France treated the U.S. soldier in World War I better," and then you've got Clemenceau saying things like their nervous system isn't as developed so they won't respond to shell shock the same way as Frenchmen will, and some really racist stuff. I mean, bringing guys from Africa in chains to the Western Front. So it really is a human disease, not just American. Mike, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Like the South compared to I always go back to that scene in The Butler.
Yes.
In The Butler where he keeps on asking to be paid for the same.
Yes.
In the White House, and he keeps on asking him through 20 years.
Yes.
And the guy will never pay him the same, and that's in Washington D.C.
Yeah.
In the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the White House.
Yep.
And they're still not granted the same opportunities.
Mike. Oh man.
All right, so
Hold on.
Yeah, hang on. So Mike Christman is going to respectfully disagree because of the way the question is phrased. During Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction,
Sure.
and radical Reconstruction, when Congress has control,
Sure.
I would argue that there is more political freedom for African Americans
Yep.
than there will be in the 1950s and into the 1960s.
Absolutely.
You have African American
Yep.
members of the House of Representatives. You even have senators from Mississippi who are elected by a black electorate.
Yeah, absolutely. Hiram Reynolds.
So politically, I would argue during Reconstruction,
Yes.
there's more political freedom there than there had ever been in the past. Obviously, slavery's gone with 13th Amendment. They
Right.
clarify citizenship. They make sure that that right to vote is not legally supposed to be infringed upon. It's after that 1876 election is when everything goes out the window.
Yep.
Because then you have the troops are gone,
Yep.
so there's no watchdog there. Not saying and totally acknowledging that there were problems during Reconstruction, but the problems are not as big.
Yeah.
And I think in our historiography we get lost in
Yep.
that sometimes. you go back and you look at a place like Georgia, where I went for a conference, and we talked about the Georgia state legislature was predominantly black during the Reconstruction era. The day that the soldiers left Atlanta, the sergeant at arms of the state legislature forcibly removed black state legislators. I think even more so on the local level, the local the town mayors, sheriffs, county sheriffs, things like that. Way more political freedom during Reconstruction. Once Reconstruction ends, I agree with you guys 1,000%.
Now, what I would say is, well, first of all, when we do it in class, the question's phrased, did Reconstruction grant, he says during, in class we said, did it, and if I asked you, did it grant freedom, you'd probably say, did the period achieve what its goal was, you'd probably say no. But I would argue, actually, I'm going to disagree a little bit there. After the Panic of 1873, I think the North's view of Reconstruction vastly changes, which would put it within the time frame of Reconstruction. I think it's the Panic of 1873 sets you on the road to compromise. In the major urban centers, like in Georgia, what you just pointed out, you're going to have those troops there till the very day of 1876, 1877. But after the Panic of 1873, the country becomes fed up with the Reconstruction era. Like, isn't this done yet? Aren't we through this yet? We're worried about economics. Do we really have time to worry about a group of people that the vast majority of Americans don't care about? So I guess I would argue that happened earlier, but I would agree with you that, I didn't even mention that, but the radical period of Reconstruction from 66 to, I would say, 73 was very successful in a lot of cases. The Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen's Schools, it was successful on a very large scale. So you're right, Mike. I'm happy you brought that up.
If we have any history geeks who are listening and want to read a great book, read The Capital Men. All about the politics and the political freedom that African Americans get and then lose. And that's the big.
Because they are doing amazing things, and we talk about Hiram, and one of the sets of sources looks at Hiram Revels. There's a message from General Oliver Howard talking about how thirsty they are for knowledge, and so like source set A is like the positives, all that stuff, like all them exercising during Radical Reconstruction period, and then B and C are the Klan starts. Panic of 1873,
White League,
and things like that. The Union as it was, and that was published in 1874. The Union as it was, so that's what always, kind of colored my view of it.
I think it's always important to acknowledge that just because a law changes, you don't change the culture. When we talk about like the caste system in India and the untouchables, we say, well, it's illegal, but does that really mean people don't treat people poorly?
Yes.
And I think that
that's
always
big concept for students to understand. Like, do you find that students have a problem understanding that?
Yeah, and that they don't understand, well, if it's illegal, how do people get away with it? But then if you draw the comparisons to the United States.
It's so hard for them to understand, like, just because it's a law doesn't mean it's going to happen, like, African Americans voting. So Mike and I show them that scene from Free State of Jones where they walk in and there's guns, and, we don't have the Republican tickets. And then it shows the election results, they all drop their ballots in, and,
I use the example of the speed limit in town.
Yeah, right.
I mean, the speed limit's 35. Does that mean everybody does 35? Oh, no. Well, hello, that's the law, right? Yeah.
So that's going to bring it to the end of our show today. We're at an hour and 13 minutes. That's right in the zone we wanted to be at, even a little over. I hope you bear with us. I'm sure we'll get better at this as time goes along.
Hopefully.
I hope you think we did a good job. I hope you ask more questions. Remember, email us at holleyhistory65@gmail.com. Hopefully the Twitter page will be up soon. You can tweet questions in. You can see any of the teachers here and submit questions. They can be anonymous. You don't have to put your name on it. Or you can put your name and get the shout out on there. So we hope that you join us for our next podcast. Thank you so much for listening again. This is Holley History from the Holley Central School District Library signing off. Thank you.